I want to say a few words about our reading this week, which is really quite short and not that difficult to follow, because really what Hunter does is really summarizes the broad views of what he's done. And he's about to show us his perspective and give us his notion of how to sort of obviate between these different views that he's advocated in respect to the Christian left, the Christian right, and what I'd call the Anabaptist view, and give his point of view, in which he calls faithful presence, which we will see next week as we look at it to see how this stacks up in terms of the ideas that he's already advocated and mooned for. And don't forget that Hunter is not a theologian. He doesn't have biblical expertise in theology. He's a sociologist primarily. Obviously, he's got many, many good things to say, but I'll raise this question to you before I seek to present some ideas to you that might help to answer it in a different way. The title of the book, To Change the World. And the presumption is, of course, is that everybody wants a changed world because the world is flawed. It's not what it should be. And we have no doubt about that. The question is then, well, what has he done? He's done it. He's given us an infinitive there, to change the world. There's no subject, there's an implied subject, I presume, and that is either the people who are reading the book, which would be Christians and people who aren't Christians, of various kinds, or it could be directed to Christians only, which is the presumption probably that most of us have had, if not all of us, as we started to read this book. And we're now being led down a particular path. In other words, the idea is that the questions that you asked are going to receive answers because you have framed the question in such a way that it will determine the structure of the answer or where the answer will come from. Actually, this goes back to Socrates, who believed in the immortality of the soul, in which I believe he argued that knowledge is not something that you learn through sort of sussing it out, but it's rather something that you recollect when you come across it, because all knowledge is fragmentary as we know it, and all knowledge goes back to a state of purity of what you might, well, I don't mean purity in the sense of holiness, I mean purity in the sense of the ideal of everything that's in the spiritual, meaning the non-physical world. This is what I've learned as a sort of a Platonic concept, that behind everything that there is, this is the way, a main Greek way of thinking that goes back the 5th century BC at least, is that the world of knowledge or experience of what we have is a world that is held together not by the molecules or atoms of its existence, but rather a spiritual, meaning an invisible, eternal world that's behind it. And this world, you might refer to it, you might come across it as being referred to as the ideal, or you could put the term God there, not necessarily the Christian notion of God, but perhaps the notion of God that's in Romans 1 verses 20 following, which Paul seems to be saying that you come to a knowledge of who God is by just looking at creation. So there's no prerequisite of learning the idea that, I'm just getting my cat out of the way. You come to the notion that without the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, Paul would say you're still accountable, because what you can see of the magnificence of God, his greatness, is there in the things to be made. Well, from what I'm saying, and my understanding is that the idea then that's behind the Platonic notion is that there is I don't know, I'll use Aristotle's term, I think, an unmoved mover. There's a force, a world, or to put it in simple terms that you learn in philosophy, every chair that you see in the natural world has an existence that gives it meaning, because in the immaterial, ideal world, the spiritual world, according to this kind of Greek thinking, there is a chair. And that chair is sort of like a blueprint of everything that is. So that when we come across knowledge, then knowledge, according, I go back to what I was saying about Socrates, is the basis of recollecting what we knew before we were born. That's the whole idea of the immortality of the soul. Now, having said that, and how does this relate to what we're talking about with Hunter? Well, I'm back to the idea of the notion of to change the world. The questions that you ask determine the answers that you will give. That's really fundamental when you think about it, because the frame of the question will determine the range of answers. You don't, well, how can I put it? People in China presumably don't wake up in the morning, or the majority of them, the billions of them, and think, democracy. Democracy is right. It should be a democracy. They don't think like that, because from birth they've been taught otherwise, right? So in this particular notion then of what we're dealing with is that the questions that we ask are determined by the structure of what's being given to us. And in Hunter's case, he's basically saying to us, our job is to change the world, if I can put it bluntly like that. And that question, if I can turn his statement, the title of his book, into a question, is who is to change the world? Well, everybody's about changing the world in some form, because whether people acknowledge it or not, they recognize that the world is not the way that it's supposed to be, that they can be better than what is. In fact, I came across this argument a while ago with a Christian philosopher at Notre Dame University, Alvin Plantinga, and William Lane Craig, also a Protestant theologian, has argued this, is that if atheism or naturalism, all that exists now, going from that Greek tradition to the present tradition of materialism, that there is no supernatural, spiritual, ideal world behind everything, but rather all that exists is molecules, atoms, energy in different forms, and it can be all explained materially, then Plantinga's argument is then why should you think in any way that what you think is truth? Because if what you say is true, then what's really happening is that the forces, the unseen forces of evolution, are constructing reality in a way for its own survival. And that does not necessarily have anything to do with truth. That doesn't mean that some things are true and some things are not true, but it does mean that there's a direction that's been given. And the question is then that direction, is it worthwhile even talking about the notion of truth if it's guided by an evolution that's completely and totally impersonal? And so there's no notion that there's an objective reality behind it through which to ascertain whether something is true or not. And the assumption that, or one assumption of what Hunter is saying, is that the world does need to be changed, and there is a world that's out there, a real world. All right. Well, we won't go any further on that, because we all accept that. That I'm talking about the objective nature of the world outside. Now, I say we all accept it. There's a lot of Christian people, Christian theologians who don't. They have a form of idealism because the world can't be separated from our subjectivity. And that's one of the problems that naturalism has, because you can't talk about the actual world out there without talking about it through the lens of subjectivity, which doesn't exist if there is no such thing as the soul or the spirit or the mind, and the mind can be reduced to molecular structures in the brain. And if that's the case, then we don't have subjectivity. As one philosopher, Dennett, said, consciousness is an illusion, which I don't think is the case. When people argue that to me, I ask them about the word intention. How do you explain the notion of, I intend to do such and such tomorrow? You can't explain that on any physiological level, on any materialistic level. It's something that comes from the consciousness of a mind. And it's a, well, I don't know what to call it, a hint or a suggestion that the human person is more than the physiological elements that make us up. All right, I'm going perhaps a bit too deep in this at this point, so let me go back again to Hunter's title, which is, yes, then let's agree with him, we are to change the world because the world is not what it should be. Now that notion of should or oughtness, where does that come from? Is that something that's surely is that a Christian notion? Or is it a universal notion? Well, it's certainly a Christian notion. In fact, I once came across an illustration many years ago by a theologian called Francis Schaeffer. I may have said this to you, in which he said that if every baby that's born, all God has to do is to put a sort of a watch or a recorder on his or her wrist, and then just ask that child to live and grow up to be an adult, and record every time that child says, or that adult says, something regarding what I'd call the fact of, or the law of oughtness, which is something like, don't tread on my toes, I didn't tread on yours. Give me a piece of your orange, I gave you a piece of mine. All the impositions that we put upon people because we know by assumption of what is right and what is true. That's universal. Now, that actually, when you think about it, conflicts with what Hunter is talking about. Well, I still haven't dealt with the title yet before I get to Hunter's chapter. I'm thinking of the idea of, we have to be careful with this notion. I'll raise it very simply. Is it the job of the Christian to change the world? That's a pretty tall order, isn't it? My job is to change the world. Is to change the world, meaning to make it sort of better than what it is. And if we do that, then how do we do it? Now, the reason I'm saying this is because we can fall into a trap, the trap that, well, Hunter mentions in the chapter from page 197 there, when he talks about pluralism and how difficult it is now to talk in terms of oughtness, of what one must do. Because the framework of oughtness, and the way that I've been talking about it, stems from a belief that behind everything there is an eternal order. There's a God who has subscribed what it is that the world must be and how we are to live in it. Now that, up to, let's say, the 16th century, was something that was advocated by the church in the Western world. The church had the authority, the church stood for God. I think of the Roman Catholic Church, especially from the 5th century, or if you want, I'm not a Roman Catholic, perhaps you might trace it back to Constantine, and so forth. The idea, though, is that there is an objective sort of umbrella of oughtness over the whole of the world, and that's given to us by God. Now we know, I'm sure in your readings in history, certainly from the Enlightenment, this 18th century, I'd go back and say that the elements of it were already manifest in the Reformation with the breaking away from the authority of the church. Luther originally wanted to reform the church, but very quickly realized that that had to go, and he saw the church in a completely different way. And so therefore he was instrumental in whether you can say he intended it or didn't intend it, created the multiplicity of Protestant churches, or what we call Protestant churches, that were initially protests against the status quo, but it became more than a protest. It became a total, I don't know what to call it, a movement in itself. But that movement is a movement towards individualism. As the Roman Catholic theologians of the 16th century might be saying, what is going on here? You know, the populace in Europe could hardly read or write, and they certainly couldn't understand our theology, which is written in Latin, because many of them couldn't even read or write their own language. But now what do I have? Well, Luther has translated the scriptures. First of all, they've been given to the populace. They're not in the church now. They're given to the populace, and the populace now can read the scriptures in German. So the theologian might be saying, what I have now is I have every Tom, Dick, or Harry, or Harriet. Every shoemaker on the street is wanting to argue theology with me. In other words, then the focus is more now towards the individual having authority to question what the representations of absoluteness and oughtness, i.e. I'm thinking of the Roman Catholic Church, have to say. Well, that I won't digress into that. I'll just push it along and say that movement towards autonomy, or the autonomous nature individual, goes right through the Enlightenment, goes right through even I think through the Declaration of Independence and the various revolutionary wars in France and in the US in the 18th century, manifest this to the point today. I'm leading now to Hunter's first point, which is what we're dealing with now is a complete misunderstanding, because we can't be sure about what the nature of language is anymore, because we've lost some sense of an absolute reference point. Or I'll use his term, there's no fixed point of reference anymore, because we've pushed God out of the picture. God's gone. Now then if God's gone, then it's harder for us to talk about God, for one thing, because there is no sort of reference point unless people are familiar with the Bible, and from the Bible have constructed a worldview on how they see themselves in it, which is problematic in itself, as Hunter has brought out. And therefore language becomes very difficult. Now, one obvious example of that is the present day notion of what the word marriage means. The word marriage, which has been sort of circumscribed as the locus of what it means to be a human being in community, i.e. a social being, has been understood in a binary nature in respect to male and female for centuries, whereas only recently it's been changed, and now same-sex relationships are referred to as a marriage right across the Western world. And there's much debate still on that, of whether in the culture wars, whether this is a discussion that needs to be argued over because it's a hill worth dying on. This is the Christian rights version of secularism. That what we're doing is losing our identity. It's what's driven the millions of people, at least who are evangelicals, presumably it's one of the main reasons that they've moved then toward supporting policies of Mr. Trump in the past, because of this notion that marriage is a social contract that's based upon the binary nature of what it means to be a human being. That's just one example. I've mentioned other examples. Obviously, one other one would be abortion. The whole idea that there is no value in the human being, or rather, to put it in terms of social justice, of critical sort of race theory or neo-Marxism that I mentioned, the human being is not a completely integrated self that has value because there's an external fixed point, i.e. God, that gives the human being its value. Rather, the human being must be looked at in a different way, from the standpoint of the utility of what you might call social justice. But social justice now, these two terms, have been removed from an understanding that's based upon foundations as theological. And that leads, and then of course, as I've mentioned, the idea of whether it's sort of soft socialism or hard totalitarianism or old line communism. The idea is that you're a commodity that has no value other than your social existence in the state. And your percentage of value in the what I'd call post-modern situation of organizations that are deeply influenced in universities, where, as Hunter has pointed out, we've lost the battle. These notions are that your value is seen in terms of your minority status. How disenfranchised are you? You're black, or you're brown, or you're a lesbian, and you can just build up your social status that you're poor and so on. And the more ticks that you have in respect to your disenfranchisement, the more power you have, because the Caucasian white hierarchy of the Western world has determined what value is, that has slipped in there and based the notion of meaning from a standpoint of a sort of a white male God. I'm giving a far left example. Then has structured reality in such a way that we now reject. But having said that they want to reject it, they still want to change the world. And they want to change the world on the basis of social justice. So in other words, it's as hard for them as what it is for us, because language now is very difficult. When we talk about marriage, we've got to talk in a certain way. In other words, we've got to define it. When we talk about human beings and all the pronouns that we use, he, she, they, etc., meaning not the plurality of individuals, but a certain kind of human being, as we understand life from a non-binary nature. So I think that Hunter rightly points out there the fact that it's very easy to become lost in a very subjective world. The Christian right has sought to rectify that in its onslaught against secularism, in the way that I've defined secularism. And the Christian left, I'm just giving you the example that Hunter does in the pages, seeks to be relevant, not so much to be against secularism, but to use secularism for what it is, to be relevant, to draw people to God or Christ. The example that he gives, and you may be familiar with this, you may be even part of it, I don't know, that used to be called the seeker-sensitive church. In other words, people can't take the old sort of services with hymns and vested garments and rituals and so on. So what are they used to? Well, in secular culture, popular society, young people are used to up-tempo music and lights and excitement and so on, and a show. And that's led in the last 25 to 30 years the rise of the community church, and in its extreme form, seeker-sensitive services, which used to be notions where you invite people to come to church on a Saturday night. In other words, it's sort of like a pre-church entrance sort of thing, where they can't take Sunday morning because it's just too arcane and out of kilter with what they know. So you give them a little dose of it. You make, to put it in Hunter's terms, you make relevance who you are by applying it in their terms. So you have rock and roll with drums and so forth, and lots of high energy music, and people doing things together, singing in unison songs. My cat is wanting to go outside. Have to wait. And from that standpoint, when people, if they can accept a kind of Christianity that comes through that, and there's a lot of talk about whether that's valid or not, just think of what's been going on with Joel Osteen or Brian Houston, and or the Jesus culture of Bill Johnson and so forth. All of that can be looked at from the standpoint of relevance too. And the question then becomes, all right, what are we trying to do here? Are we changing the creed? I'm going now back to the against view, or the Christian right view. The creed meaning, I'm thinking of the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, going right back to the beginning of sort of what are the foundational doctrines of the Christian faith. That's what gives us our worldview. Are we prepared to go along with ethical ideals, sort of seeker-sensitive service, and talk in their language? Don't forget, this is the language of the postmoderns. I've got to let the cat out when I'm talking, so I'll do that best I can. So we talk in terms of postmoderns, and we talk in terms of ideals without making reference to the creed of what we believe about who Jesus Christ is, what the elemental nature of the universe is as it comes down to the relationship that exists within the triunity of God, of Father, Son, and Spirit. Very, very heavy concepts. Now, having said that then, the question is, who are we when we're doing this, and in what context are we talking? Because we can't talk anymore. This is Hunter's point of view. I should say, it's what he's bringing out. Let's put it this way, it's not his point of view, but he's bringing it out because he'll have to deal with it. Forget the culture wars. We've lost the battle. The question is, who are we, and how are we to establish our identity as Christians? Do we play the same game as the social justice warriors who are working for racial, economic, political equality and so forth? Can we do it on their principles? And if we do it on their principles, now this is the progressive left, do we reach a point where we abandon our Christian fundamentals, the creed? Or can we do it as an entrance to get to them? And who are we when doing this? Well, I want to give you, I've got to stop because I've been talking too long. Wow, half an hour. I have to stop. Because I want to show you my cards in a way which will help in the critique, or perhaps your understanding of what I'll be looking for. And I'm not necessarily looking for people who agree with my point of view. I just ask you to consider the evidence, which is the idea of our job is not to change the world. Our job is to be who we're called to be, which is the church. If we're called to be the church, and that means by church, I mean a social, political phenomenon, that's an oxymoron in itself, because in most minds amongst Christians, the idea of the church is something that's sort of like an appendage in society. It's sort of like an institution like Target or something. It's there in the suburbs, but it doesn't run anything, doesn't do anything. You can have all your beliefs and so on, but when it comes down to it, what functions in society to change society has to do with the hard nature of politics. And I think, to me, whether you look at the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, you see that right now in the way that religious language is used, but the actual meaning that's embodied within that, as I brought out, in terms of what people actually believe when they function religiously, it's frequently without recourse to the foundational, what you might call worldviews, or what Christianity is. Whereas the church is meant to be what? Well, we're meant to be disciples of Jesus. To put it in John's terms, in 1 John, we're not in the world, we're not of the world, even though we're in the world. And it's a very difficult thing for us because the idea of the church then, and this actually does lead into Hunter's view. It goes with the Anabaptist view, and it goes with with Hunter's view's faithful presence, as you'll see next week. The idea is that the church, for the church to do its job, it has to have this faithful presence. The faithful presence is to God, not to the world. That's why Hunter has influenced people like Rod Dreher with his book, The Benedict Option, and his current book, Live Not by Lies, in which he's basically arguing that we're moving towards a soft totalitarianism, that in a generation's time, he uses the example of communism in the 20s through the 50s in the Soviet Union to say that's hard totalitarianism. We'll be facing a soft totalitarianism where it will be harder for us as Christians to get jobs and to function well in the society because we have to be tolerant of everyone else in whatever form of pluralism, postmodernism, whatever beliefs that they have. And so what Hunter wants to say is that then, well, it's very obvious to say that the church must be the church, primarily, and not enter into politics in a way that it can somehow match up to the political sphere and become a political entity that has power that will change the world from that standpoint. And that's quite difficult in the present situation of what's happened in the last 12 months with the virus. Because what the virus has done is it's divided the church, hasn't it? Most of us are zooming into our worship services and therefore victim to the whole self-perpetuating isolation of cyberspace through Zoom, in which we think we're having fellowship and church together through electronic means, but not through personal and social circumstances. And that's what Hunter is going to move towards, in which he calls faithful presence, is that we must retreat and find out who we are first, so that we're not dissipated into moving towards such a accommodation of the social justice warriors on their terms, which we think is on our terms, where we reach a point where the church ceases to be the church. Oh, the only point, then I'll finish on this one point. If there is social justice, it can't be done on the framework of a pluralistic, no fixed abode reference point of reality of people who have that point of view. In other words, the point of view that there is an oughtness on where we're to live, but we can't actually define it in terms of the value of the human being from a theological standpoint. I want to say that as we go forward, whatever social justice means, it must be tied to the church. It must come from out of a theology of what it means to be a Christian, which goes back to the crucifixion of Christ. Well, I've gone on a bit there. All right, I'll hold it there today.